Now, to this point in American history, leisure was often confused with laziness. If you didn't have anything to do, then you're just lazy and you don't have initiative. When sometimes you just may be done with your work and you want to take a load off. Maybe you want to catch the Mavericks game, or maybe you want to, I don't know, go see a concert or something of the sort. It was in this era, after now you've established industrial working hours and wages, and you've tried to define your average work week, that people would sometimes find themselves with extra time on their hands, maybe a couple bucks on their hands too. Okay, why not go down to the local coffee house or pub and have yourself a decent little time? Maybe why don't you go catch the Cowboys game on Saturday or Sunday rather, that sort of a thing. Okay, so it was around this time that you started to develop the idea of mass entertainment that could help people pass through the time. Now, in the coronavirus era, especially in quarantine or whatnot, mass entertainment was different. You may be in your house for pretty much all day long and you're going to watch TV and you're going to catch every single show on Netflix and you can recite Tiger King's biggest quotes. Okay, great. If you're watching this several years from now, you're probably going to be like, Tiger King, wow, my God, I forgot about. Yeah, wow. Um, Otherwise, though, um, one of the things that mass entertainment did was it could help bridge the gap between classes and races. Um, for example, if you've ever been in New Orleans, Louisiana, you would understand there's some pretty big race divide in New Orleans. You have your black neighborhoods and you have your non-black neighborhoods. Whether you're white or black in New Orleans, though, one thing is true that binds all of you. You're all Saints fans. The Saints. One of my best friends is a Saints fan, and his other Saints friends are some of the most obnoxious football fans I've ever seen. Who them saying they could beat them Saints? Who that? Who that? Okay. I don't care if you're white or black. If you're a Saints fan, you both know that who dat, and you both live the who dat life, and you love the New Orleans Saints. You could be from different ends of the political spectrum. You could come from different races, different socioeconomic status, totally different views. But if you both love the New Orleans Saints, then you are one and the same. Okay, so that could be something that ties people together. Mass entertainment. And it was around this time that you started to see the advent of spectator sports. I mentioned the New Orleans Saints. Um, Back around this time, you had a game that was born out of a British form of a sport called rounders. And it was adapted differently, and it kind of combined the rounders aspect with a little bit of cricket. And now you have an American game that was a combination of some other games that would form its own entity. We know that game today as baseball. Baseball began in the 1860s and 70s with the initial sports leagues that were very primitive at the time, but as people developed more of an interest in leisure and spectator sports, they began to develop. And by the turn of the century, now you had modern leagues like the National League and the American League that would form the eventual overarching Major League Baseball, where you'd have your initial franchises like the Boston Red Sox and Pittsburgh Pirates, and now you have your baseball leagues. Baseball, even though it's adapted from other sports, baseball is uniquely American. That is an American sport that was basically derived here in America. And it became the biggest um, the biggest avenue for working class males to reach out as far as fandom is concerned. You did have football at that time. Okay, so the NFL didn't exist yet. That didn't come around until like 1919 or so. However, you did have college football. College football was really considered at that time a little bit more of an upper class type spectator sport because it was largely centered around colleges, most specifically like the Ivy Leagues around that time. Princeton, for example. Um, Later on, that would change, but college football would eventually give way to there being a professional opportunity for a lot of these players and would eventually grow into something bigger as professional sports leagues came about, like the NFL. So nowadays, the NFL is what it is today. And of course, I'm a huge Dallas Cowboys fan. I have been since day one. I was around when they were 1-15 in 1989. I saw them win 3 Super Bowls in the 90s, and I've seen them struggle ever since then. Um, yeah, it's been interesting as a Cowboys fan. But at least they've got some hardware to show for it in their history. Otherwise, though, it is fun to watch football. It's interesting to see how the game has evolved. Very early football was more reminiscent of rugby. Okay? Football actually has a true name called gridiron. And the reason why is if you look at a football field, it's basically a grid. You've got 5 yards, 10 yards, and you've got your yard markers and your hash marks and your end zones. It's on a grid. Okay? So back then, it was called gridiron. Football is what we call soccer. The rest of the world calls football. Okay? It's a footballers club. My favourite team is Chelsea. I love football. We're going to have a match on the pitch. Okay. All right. We call it football. What they play is soccer. We play football, son. Go watch them football teams try and play each other. Basically, nowadays, you have this completely evolved game that used to be like a rugby scrum. Now it's these intricate offenses that do all these things, RPOs, screens, West Coast offense, spreads, spread option. You have all these defenses that are like 4-3 under, 3-4 under, 3-4 over, Tampa 2. You've got all these various different intricate chess-like concepts that pick apart matchups on the football field. And you're trying to do this to a defense. The defense is trying to do this to you. And it's all a brutal, physical chess match. Is what it is. I love football. Okay? That is my favorite sport. But that was largely for the wealthy back then. That would eventually change. And as you also had women who were in college, you now started to see the advent of some women's sports or women becoming involved in sports that were traditionally male dominated, like tennis, for example. Women would become tennis, and I would argue that the very best tennis players today are women. Okay? But otherwise, so basketball, what we know as basketball, was actually invented by a guy who was from Canada by the name of Naismith. He was from Canada, but it was in New York that he created basically the concept for what basketball would become at a local New York college. And now we know basketball for what it is today. I grew up watching Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, all those great Celtics and Lakers teams of the 80s and the Bulls of the 90s. That was my era. And of course, nowadays, in the 2000s, you had Dirk. I love the Mavericks, especially with Dirk. Nowadays, hopefully, Luka can get us there. So if you're watching this in a few years and Luka's either no longer there or he's gotten us a few trophies or maybe both, then okay, we'll see how we do. But otherwise, basketball, yeah, it was invented by a Canadian. It was actually in the United States that it happened. America. Okay, so LeBron James can thank Naismith for that particular development. But also around this time, you had the advent of various different theatrical performances like vaudeville, which was taken from various different French shows and adapted to American audiences that are often silent. And then, of course, you had minstrel shows that were advented around this time. Minstrel shows were often parodies where a lot of the actors would paint their faces black and basically put on blackface. Or you would actually have African American actors and they would satirize or often poke fun at African American stereotypes. We know that today as being pretty heinous. Back then, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, minstrel shows were regular forms of entertainment. As a matter of fact, you have various different songs that are made from those, like The Eyes of Texas, which is the fight song for the Texas Longhorns. That was basically adapted from Working on the Railroad, which was a parody of making fun of black people working on railroads, toiling away. And then eventually, the University of Texas would adapt their song to The Eyes of Texas, and they would sing that song during minstrel shows on campus. Okay. So, otherwise, though, that was one form of entertainment that was big around the time. But think about this. If you've ever been to Six Flags, where did the idea for amusement parks come from? And why? Why would we purposely climb all these stairs to go down this rapidly moving roller coaster, which is scary as all get out, at this very fast pace, and you're twisting and going, I'm afraid of heights. So like going on a roller coaster and you hear the very last click is like, oh boy, this is the moment of truth, and there's no going back now. You shoot down and you just, people raise their hands and you act like a bunch of morons just letting loose. Okay, that was an escape from the daily restrictions of social life in your town. Coney Island was one of the very first public entertainment venues. It's off the southern shore of Long Island in Brooklyn, where you can have a public entertainment where you can do various different things and participate in various different games, and you could, try and win prizes. Like if you've ever been to the state fair and you see on the midway all these games that you can play, you can try and win prizes. Coney Island was one of the very first public venues for public entertainment, and it almost didn't matter quite as much your status. If you wanted to escape from the various genteel nature of public life, you can get away by doing that. Okay? That had to go from somewhere. So Six Flags has Coney Island to thank, and all the people riding that Superman ride, which is stupid. Then you can thank Coney Island for that. Also around this time, you have mass communication with newspapers. If you've ever read the New York Times, like you open up a newspaper and it's USA Today or the New York Times, but you're sitting in Dallas, Texas, it was this era in American history in the late 1800s that you can thank for that. Because of technological advances through the telegraph, now you're not just able to send messages via wire like the Morse code. Now you can actually send newspaper via wire to anywhere across the country. And you can have more intricate layouts because you can wire it. You can read the New York Times live in Dallas, Texas because it was wired there. So that's how you can do that. I always wondered that as a kid. It's like, hey, isn't New York like 2,000 miles away from here? Yeah. Well, how'd they get it to me so fast? That's like Santa Claus reaching every single house in the world on Christmas Eve. Okay. Well, in this case, it was because they can send a wire that has all the newspaper contents that they can print and rapidly scroll in rapid fashion. Okay, so you send your report in overnight after your editing hours are over, and boom, next morning early, you've got the New York Times. Okay. The telephone also around this time. We talked about that in a previous segment of this chapter. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and his company, which would eventually become AT&T, for example, developed the idea of mass producing telephones but making them more readily accessible to where, okay, you want to call somebody, previously you had to actually have a line attached to somebody. Nowadays, he invented something called the switchboard. You can have an actual operator at the switchboard. You request a number to call, the operator can connect you. And if you have a repeater, you can now do that longer times out and further distances out. Eventually, with the transatlantic lines, you could call overseas, perhaps. Okay? This created a whole industry for the telephone, especially as you needed telephone operators. Nowadays, you guys, if you've never used an actual landline, um, you've got your cell phone. You never called 411 for information, or you dialed whatever that number was for the weather, or you dialed 0 for the operator, or if you've ever called collect. Uh, you've never had to do stuff like that. The operator, usually almost exclusively females in the early days at least, would have to connect you. So, operator, how may I place your call? That sort of a thing. Typically, it was a very pleasant voice that could connect your call. Oh, yes, I'd like to make a collect call to Randy Trevino. They call you up. Mr. Trevino, this is the operator for Southwestern Bell. Do you have a call from your sister? Do you accept the charges? No, I don't. Click. Just kidding, sis. All right. Otherwise, though, the telephone became more regularly used around this time, especially because you had switchboards. So a lot of things going on in the leisure and consumer society. You're watching baseball. You're going to vaudeville shows. You're going to Central Park and having a party. You might catch a game. You might call that girl that you have a crush on. All kinds of different things that are changing the way we consume entertainment.